10 years of marriage, and my husband never once laid a hand on me. Then, on a miserable, rainy Tuesday, he left $400 on the kitchen counter and threw himself off the roof of a parking garage. 7 days after we buried him, a complete stranger walked up to my front door with a wax-sealed envelope that completely obliterated every single thing I thought I knew about the man I had slept beside for a decade. My name is Clara, and for 10 grueling years, I was the quiet, dutiful, invisible wife of Julian Vance, the sole heir to one of the most ruthless financial empires on the East Coast. At his memorial, I stood frozen in high heels for 5 straight hours, accepting fake condolences from people who barely knew him. I did not cry a single tear, not because I was heartless, but because I had already cried myself completely dry inside that ice-cold mansion years ago. Julian's mother, Beatrice, sat nearby dabbing at dry eyes for the news cameras. The second the reporters turned their backs, she leaned toward me and whispered that I was a cursed, useless woman who had driven her son into an early grave. My sister-in-law, Chloe, did not even bother looking up from her phone, loudly muttering that I was probably already mentally spending the family fortune I was hoping to inherit. When the estate attorney finally gathered everyone in the study to read the will, you could hear a pin drop. The room went completely silent when he announced that every stock option, every property, and every investment trust worth over $400 million had been left entirely to me. Beatrice practically lunged across the glass table screaming that I must have poisoned his mind, while Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a thief taking what belonged to them. On the 7th evening following the funeral, while Beatrice strictly forbade me from even walking upstairs to light a candle in Julian's honor, a man in a dark trench coat appeared at the front gates. He introduced himself as Arthur, a private lawyer Julian had quietly retained years ago. He handed me a thick envelope and told me he was under strict instructions to deliver it to me at precisely 7 o'clock that evening and not a second earlier. I locked myself inside the master bedroom and tore open the seal with shaking hands. The handwriting was unmistakably Julian's, but the tone was entirely different from the brief, icy notes he used to leave on the counter. He began by writing that he had always known who I really was before our arranged marriage. A brilliant financial analyst who used to command Wall Street trading floors before giving up her entire life to fit into his mother's rigid world. Then came the confession that completely shattered my heart into pieces. Julian revealed that he suffered from a rare, private medical condition that made physical intimacy entirely impossible. Our entire cold marriage had been a carefully orchestrated cover story to shield his reputation and preserve his standing as the rightful corporate heir. He called the multi-million-dollar inheritance simple compensation for the decade of youth he had stolen from me. Toward the end of the letter, he disclosed that hidden behind our formal wedding portrait was a concealed wall safe. Inside sat a black leather ledger documenting every single illegal transaction, offshore shell account, and fraudulent wire transfer Beatrice and Chloe had executed over the past decade. He gave me the combination, which was simply the date of the very first day we met at a charity gala. I walked over to the portrait, dialed the numbers, and the heavy metal door clicked open. Inside sat the black ledger alongside a high-capacity flash drive packed with financial records. That night, I burned his letter in the fireplace, poured myself a glass of 20-year-old scotch, and drank it alone while looking out over the manicured lawn, feeling the timid, submissive woman I had been for 10 long years slowly die inside me. Later that same night, Beatrice used a master key to burst into my bedroom, furious to find me sipping liquor instead of weeping in darkness. She threatened to launch a massive public smear campaign accusing me of infidelity unless I signed over every single asset to Chloe within 72 hours. For the first time in a decade, I did not shrink back. I looked her dead in the eye and told her this house belonged to me, and she needed to get out before I had her thrown off the property. The next morning, I gathered every single drab, conservative dress Beatrice had forced me to wear, threw them into a metal trash bin on the patio, and set them on fire. I pulled a sharp, custom-tailored suit out of an old trunk I had kept hidden in the closet, threw on a pair of designer heels, and walked into the grand dining room to sit directly at the head of the long mahogany table. When Beatrice demanded that I pour her morning coffee, I calmly informed her that she had 2 working hands to do it herself. I told her I was no longer the servant of this estate, I was now the majority shareholder and board chairman. An hour later, I drove straight into the city to reclaim control of the corporate office before the executive board could quietly strip the company bare. I walked directly into an unannounced board meeting where the chief financial officer, Vance, was actively pitching a plan to move core assets into offshore accounts before I could understand the paperwork. I slammed the court-certified copy of the will onto the table, took the chair at the head of the board, and systematically picked apart his financial projections line by line until the entire room sat in absolute silence. Over the next 48 hours, I uncovered that the head of operations, Leland, was actively covering up a massive conflict of interest that threatened a multi-million-dollar development project. Instead of firing him immediately, I used the documentation from Julian's ledger to force him into absolute submission, turning an enemy into a terrified, obedient asset who answered only to me. When I returned home that evening, I found Beatrice and Chloe tearing through my private study with heavy shears, desperately looking for hidden documents. Instead of panicking, I pulled out my phone, recorded the entire frantic scene in high definition, and dialed the local police department right in front of them. Watching the color instantly drain from Beatrice's face was the most satisfying moment of my adult life. The war escalated with terrifying speed over the following week. Tabloids were suddenly flooded with fabricated stories claiming I was an opportunistic black widow who had manipulated a vulnerable heir. The company stock plunged 10% in a single afternoon as factory workers threatened to strike over rumors that I planned to shut down manufacturing plants and sell off the heavy equipment. Instead of hiding behind a public relations firm, I called an immediate press conference and stood before dozens of news cameras. I presented clear financial ledgers showing the exact corporate accounts Beatrice and Chloe had been quietly draining for years, while promising that every cent of company profit would be redirected toward securing worker pensions rather than executive bonuses. The media narrative flipped in an instant. Desperate to regain control, Beatrice staged a dramatic physical collapse in front of news crews and had herself rushed to the hospital. Knowing from Julian's records that her health was completely fine, I walked into her private room and quietly mentioned a 30-year-old corporate accident involving her late husband that she thought was buried forever. She checked herself out of the hospital that afternoon and never attempted another public stunt. Just as the market stabilized, a smooth corporate investor named Sterling offered to buy out 30% of the company under the guise of an emergency bailout. My contacts inside the financial sector quickly discovered that Sterling was actually backed by an aggressive corporate raider named Grant Mercer, who was secretly working alongside Beatrice to strip the firm down for scrap parts. I drove 2 hours through a torrential downpour to track down an old, retired plant supervisor named Miller who held massive respect among the labor union. I stood on his front porch in the freezing rain until he agreed to help me rally the factory workers, successfully preventing Mercer's team from instigating a strike that would have forced the company into immediate bankruptcy court. Chloe, completely ruined and facing severe public backlash, tried one last desperate move by filing a lawsuit to invalidate the will entirely, claiming our lack of physical intimacy proved the marriage was a total sham. I walked into the courtroom, pulled out Julian's certified medical records, and placed them quietly on the judge's desk, forcing Chloe to face the tragic reality her brother had hidden for a decade. She dropped the lawsuit on the spot in tears. Meanwhile, the former chief financial officer, Vance, attempted to download confidential corporate files to sell directly to Grant Mercer, in exchange for a private flight out of the country. I had already flagged his system access, and law enforcement officers arrested him right in the middle of a parking garage trade. As they cuffed him, he screamed that Beatrice had promised him a 10% cut of the deal. With nowhere left to run and facing federal fraud charges, Beatrice came to my office late at night, practically on her knees begging me not to send her to prison. I agreed to sign a non-prosecution agreement on one single condition: she had to sign over her entire ownership stake in the family estate to reimburse the money she had stolen from the corporate accounts over the years. Just when the dust finally began to settle, I discovered an audio file saved on Julian's drive. It revealed that Grant Mercer had been actively blackmailing him for over 3 years, threatening to expose his medical condition to the board unless he handed over controlling interest in our flagship project. That unrelenting pressure, not simple depression, was what had driven my husband to step off that roof. Grief immediately transformed into ice-cold fury. When Mercer realized his corporate takeover had failed, he attempted to trap me at an isolated construction site to force a settlement. I walked into the meeting carrying a hidden recording device, let him boast about how he had broken my husband's spirit, and gave the signal for local authorities to move in the second he admitted to extortion on tape. In the aftermath of the trial, I fired every corrupt board member who had played a role in the scheme and promoted the hardworking employees who had kept the company running from the shadows. I even offered Chloe an entry-level position at one of our regional distribution centers, after she returned every piece of jewelry she had taken from the house and asked for a second chance. Using my own personal funds rather than corporate money, I established a foundation dedicated to providing specialized medical care and privacy support for individuals living with the exact condition Julian had suffered from, ensuring no one else would ever feel forced to live a life built on absolute secrecy and shame. 6 months later, a prestigious hedge fund in London offered me an executive partner position that would have taken me far away from the town that held so many painful memories. For several days, I seriously considered walking away from the estate, the boardroom, and the lingering shadows of my past to start entirely fresh in a brand new country. Late one evening, I stood on the glass balcony of the corporate building, looking down at the illuminated skyline and the thousands of employees whose livelihoods now depended on the stability I had fought so hard to build. I realized that true strength was not about escaping the damage left behind by others, but standing firm on the ground you had reclaimed from the fire. I called London and politely declined the offer. A full year after the day Julian died, I drove out to the coastal cliffs at dawn, took off my shoes, and walked barefoot into the cold tide. I pulled off my gold wedding ring, looked at it one last time, and tossed it far out into the ocean waves, watching it sink beneath the water. The fragile, silent woman who had arrived here 10 years ago was gone forever, and in her place stood someone who had built an entire future out of the ashes.